CIVICUS, a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society throughout the world, has released its annual State of Civil Society Report for 2021. The report analyzes how contemporary events and trends are impacting on civil society and how civil society is responding to the major issues and the problems of the day. This year marks the 10th edition of the report, and to tell us more about the 2020 and indeed the past decade of civil action, my colleague Peter Ndoro spoke to Advocacy and Campaigns Lead at CIVICUS, David Kode.
David Kode, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having me.
This important CIVICUS annual report comes at a time where we've been through around the world and are still going through a COVID-19 pandemic. Did that influence what you analysed and what's in the report?
Yes, it most certainly did, principally from the point of view that the main arguments of the report speak to the fact that protests are relevant, that protest actions are making a difference, but more especially that protest actions, even in the course of a pandemic, are making a difference. And it's very important to note that some of the protest actions that we saw over the last year or so across the world actually emanated from the restrictions that governments placed under the guise of curbing the pandemic. So the pandemic made no difference as far as protests are concerned, but some of the findings that we get from the report relate to the fact that even in the midst of the pandemic, there were still protests that happened in different countries around the world.
Your report says that the pandemic actually proves the need for civil society. How so?
Because if you look at the policies and the strategies implemented by many governments across the world to curb the pandemic, those policies were actually created without adequate consultations with civil society. But yet, in many countries, when states were either unable or unwilling to provide some of the basic needs of their communities and citizens to fight the pandemic, whether it's adequate information on what the pandemic is about and how the effects of the pandemic can be addressed, or whether it's providing funding for communities that did not have funding, or basic necessities that citizens needed to be able to protect themselves from the pandemic. We saw civil society stepping up, moving to communities, providing cash where cash was needed. In a country like Ethiopia, civil society groups came together, contributed funding for their communities, and governments actually then came in later to complement such efforts. So across the world, particularly with communities that needed assistance, it was civil society that stood up and actually played the role that governments are supposed to play.
Beyond COVID-19, there were many, many other issues around the world. Which ones come to mind? I mean, in my mind, one of the things that we saw last year a lot and through to this year, hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Very, very significant as far as racial justice issues are concerned. I mean, a few days ago, we celebrated on the 25th of May, the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd. That really brought to light, issues of racism in the United States. And so I agree with you, beyond the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, dominated international headlines. and really, spoke about the need for racial justice, not just in the United States, because we saw similar Black Lives Matter protests in the UK, even in South Africa, and then there was a replication of that, the NSAS protests in Nigeria, that also spoke about the actions of police. So very significant, not just for a year where we all experienced the pandemic, but for future and for years to come.
What kind of mobilizations did you see on the continent in Africa? What kind of issues were really mainstream for Africans?
What we found most significant were mobilizations around elections, mobilizations around actions by states to amend constitutions so that presidents could extend their stay in power. So if you look at Guinea, if you look at Cote d'Ivoire, the mobilizations there actually revolved around constitutionalism and the need for citizens to see democratic transitions. If you look at Uganda, mobilization centered around elections. If you look at a country like Malawi, mobilizations played a crucial role in ensuring that elections were rerun, and that led to a stable democratic transition. We also had mobilizations in relation to austerity measures and economic decisions that were taken by states, from Zimbabwe, to Sudan, decisions that were taken by states to and other international financial institutions to kind of, impose economic policies, and citizens fought against those policies that were implemented.
Let me ask you this then. Do these civil actions make a difference? Have you seen this past year these actions that civil society have taken and citizens have taken actually impacting and making a change?
To a certain extent, yes. But even as civil society, we conclude that the actions were not did not bring the kind of changes that we anticipated. But if you look at the democratic changes that were made in Malawi, the actions of the judiciary were complemented by street protests and public mobilizations. In Sudan, female genital mutilation was banned thanks to the actions of some brave women. If you move outside of the continent, in Chile, the constitution was actually, there was a decision made to change the constitution through a democratic means, and that was because people took to the streets. So when you look at Zimbabwe and the clampdown on protests, and even in many countries in West Africa, the protests did not lead to the changes that were anticipated. But when you see governments react violently to protest actions, that means the protests are touching a nerve, and that means it's a sign that governments are really scared of mass mobilizations, because it seems as if that's one of the ways in which changes will be made in the future. It seems as if because of the failure of political institutions to do what they were created to do, it's now very obvious that protest would be one way in which change happens, whether it's a change in a regime or a change in policies that affect citizens.
You talked about these mobilizations in Africa. I'm mindful that the average age of an African citizen is just over 19, so it's a very youthful continent. Were they the ones at the forefront of a lot of these mobilizations and the speaking out?
Yes, to a very large extent, from the NSAS mobilizations in Nigeria to calls for economic changes in Malawi and even in South Africa, most of these movements are led by youth. principally because they are fed up with the systems. If you look at the average tenure of an African president, it's between 15 and 30 years. So for many youth in around the continent, you can look at Uganda, Cameroon, and many other countries. The youth have not known any other leader but the ones that are currently in place. And the promises that were made from when these youth were children, they've not seen them materialize. So Africans always say to the youth, you are the future. But then these youths are now in their early 20s, late 20s and early 30s, and they've not seen any signs of change. And what's really difficult to comprehend is that there's really no sign that there will be any changes in the near future, whether it's in terms of the implementation of economic policies that lead to employment, or it's in terms of the older generation giving way to the younger generation to govern.
This report is the 10th one, which means you've been at it for a decade now. I wonder, looking back, what sort of trends have you started to see evolve over time?
So the report actually identifies 10 major trends, and I'll make mention of a few. One trend that we identified over the last 10 years, and which we still see at the moment, is that there's a massive clampdown on civic space. So when people speak up, when journalists raise concerns, when human rights defenders or civil society hold governments to account, there's, in many countries, an instant response from the government, and sometimes this takes the form of violence. The report also mentions the rise of authoritarian states, particularly in countries that used to be democratic. So if you look at Hungary, if you look at even the United Kingdom, there are policies that are implemented in these states that actually restrict fundamental freedoms. The report also looks at the rise of social media and the impact that has. If there's a protest in Zimbabwe, for example, almost every country around the world knows about the protest. They don't just know, but they see visuals, they see the actions of state. So, social media plays a very important role in facilitating human rights and in holding governments to account, because it shows exactly what governments do as far as human rights violations are concerned. And then the report also looks at, the economic inequalities that arrive in many countries around the world. And that, those economic inequalities are actually the source of many of the protests that we are seeing in different countries, particularly those in Africa.
Looking to the future, what sort of challenges do you think still need to be met, and what are your hopes?
Our hopes are that, we would see, less violent actions from states in response to protests. It's very sad to see that, political systems, elections are not bringing the changes that they're supposed to bring. And so we're likely to see more mobilizations across the continent because state institutions have failed to a very large extent. So we're hoping that governments would allow for an enabling environment for citizens to express their views. We are also seeing movements that are beyond the traditional civil society formations that we all know. What we are seeing in countries like Sudan, what we are seeing in countries like Malawi, what we saw a few years ago in a country like Gambia, we hope that, other authoritarian states from Togo to Cameroon to Uganda would see the kind of changes that we've seen. And we are hopeful for when we look at countries like Tanzania, that has just experienced a political transition. We also hope to see less of the militarization of politics as we look at what's happening in Mali and the Central African Republic. So we want to see, an Africa where states understand that an enabling environment is conducive for prosperity, for economic development, and for democracy to take root.
So where can people get this report? I hope it's free. Can they go onto your website and download it?
It's absolutely free. You can go to www.civicus.org and you'd find the report. You can download from the Civicus website and it's free of charge.
David Kode, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and bringing this important work that civil society does and can do in terms of making a better world for all of us. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thanks for having me.